Hello, good morning, everyone from a hotel room in Washington, D.C. to History Matters, and so does water. What can I tell you?
I'm in a water bottle reveal.
There will be a water bottle reveal.
Oh, okay.
It's not a normal water bottle. Anyway, good morning, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about Washington, D.C. kind of as a representative city. And when I was making up the title, I had a parentheses slaveholding representative city, I think. And then I thought, nah, I'm not putting that in parentheses. That's just like smack up center slaveholding. But at any rate, we're going to talk a little bit about how Washington doesn't represent the wider us and how that's been true or not true in history. But before I delve into that topic, I turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who is in the opposite of a hotel room, who will tell us the rules of the game.
Hi, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and I am in my tree house, as I like to think of it, my screen porch outside of Charlottesville, Virginia.
I'm
having some work done on my kitchen, which seems like an endless project, but we're in the home stretch, we think. So we are excited to have you. I know some of our friends who are teachers are zooming in saying, oh, I'm live this week. I don't have to wait to watch the recording because school's out. So for those of you who are done, hooray. For those of you who have a couple more weeks, hang in there. And for those of you watching this later in the archives, we're fabulous. But here's how this is going to work. For the next 30 minutes, Joanne's going to talk about a topic. When she is done, I'm going to check the Q&A, and that's where you come in. You will be putting your questions into the Q&A, and then in about 30 minutes, we'll start our discussion. All right, I'll see y'all in a little bit.
Excellent. And I will say, as I always say, if you are here for the first time, please do let us know, because the wonderful History Matters community will give you a robust welcome, because it's truly a wonderful community. So be sure that when you're commenting to everyone, and let us know. I always love to know. This one little party hat just went up my screen, which is kind of funny and pitiful at the same time. But at any rate, do let us know. Okay, thank you. There's more stuff coming up on the screen now. I feel better. I was kind of sad. At any rate, okay. So what I do want to talk about today is Washington, D.C., kind of as a representative city, right? And it's supposed to be in a literal kind of a way, but I think it actually is representative in many ways. And I suppose part of my thinking on this was inspired by the fact that I went to the Museum of African American History and Culture yesterday and spent a good chunk of hours there. It's a pretty amazing museum, and I'll be happy in our after party to talk about that. But at any rate, and I will say, and it's going to be related to some of what I'm saying today, it's only been there since 2016, right? That was when it was dedicated. It was 2016 by Barack Obama. That's really not a long time ago. And the fact that it's that recently that we got that kind of major museum about African American history and culture kind of is in line with some of what I'm going to be talking about today, particularly about Washington. Now, from the very beginning, I always find early Washington, D.C. particularly interesting to write about and to think about, because it was literally meant to be a representative city, right? And it was an unusual capital city in the sense that, as everything else that the United States did in this period, like, we need to start from scratch. We need something new. Let's create a capital city. And so ultimately, that's what we end up with Washington and the creation of Washington. And literally and many of you probably already know this, but I find it fascinating regardless. The layout of the major government buildings was meant to be a physical embodiment of the government, meaning, for example, that at one end of Pennsylvania Avenue is the Capitol, and at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue is the White House, and that's very a deliberate message, right? That the branches of Congress are separate, and they need to be separate, and they're actually divided, that they are in a permanent showdown on Pennsylvania Avenue. And there are many ways in which the city itself very deliberately was meant to embody what the new nation was going to be. And thus the sort of, enormous massively ambitious buildings that they were creating at a very early point. Some people called the city of Washington the city of magnificent distances, and some people called it the city of magnificent ambitions. It's like, well, yeah, we're going to get there for sure. Or magnificent intentions, even better, not just ambitions, magnificent intentions. That yeah, they're trying there in Washington, D.C. The fact that so many aspects of early American history are so deliberate and yet weirdly self-conscious is one of the many things that has kept me grounded in one way or another very often in early America. So the layout of Washington is supposed to embody our constitutional government. Great ambitions, great intentions. There's a great quote about early Washington, which is in my book. I was mentioning probably before all of you were here, that given that I'm in Washington and I don't have my actual book with me, it took me a little while to realize. I kept thinking, wow, there's a quote in my book I could use. Oh no, I don't have a copy of my book. And it was remarkably late this morning that I realized my entire book manuscript is in my computer because I wrote it on here. So, but I still didn't fully have a huge chunk of time to find the quote. But the quote says something like, Washington, D.C. looks as though the British Museum is placed itself in the middle of an exhausted brick field. It's like there's nothing, and then there's like building, and that kind of represents American ambitions and the sort of lack of a reality to back it up, particularly in the early period. Now, the other thing that I think is striking, and that people at the time in early America thought was striking about Washington, not necessarily Southerners. Southerners believed, and I think rightly so, that Washington was a Southern city, and I'm going to come back to that momentarily. But when people who were not from the South came to Washington to be in Congress, to be in government, to visit or whatever, people who did not normally live amidst all of the trappings of a real slave society, that was what hit them. I think it's Horace Mann who referred to Washington as slave land. He wrote a letter home, I think at some point in the 1850s, I think to his wife, it said something like, here I am in slave land again, that it struck you when you were in the city, whether you were attuned to that as someone who was assertively anti-slavery or abolitionist, or whether you weren't. There were auction blocks in the city, there were slave pens in the city, there were occasional slave gangs, coupled slave gangs being marched through the city. It wasn't invisible. It's a Southern city, or it was at the time, particularly a very Southern city, and visitors always commented on that. And Southerners, as we'll hear shortly, were rather insistent upon that fact when it came time that kind of declaration really mattered. It was a Southern city, and so people who came there, like the star of my last book, Benjamin Brown French, who is from New Hampshire, actually a relatively small town in New Hampshire, and he comes to Washington to be a clerk for the House of Representatives, and that's one of the things that he can't quite believe that he's seeing. Not that there are no slaves in New Hampshire at the time, but very few. And he comes to Washington, and it's, you know, he doesn't use the phrase slave land, but he might as well have. There's a letter he writes to his wife, which again, I think is quoted somewhere in my book, in which he just doesn't quite know what to do with the fact that there are enslaved people in the boarding house that he's staying in, and that they do what they're told to do. And he can't quite, on the one hand, he's kind of fascinated, and on the other hand, it doesn't sit right with him, and he doesn't quite know. I talk in the book about how this person who's not used to a slave society, weaving his way in and out of trying to feel better about it so that he doesn't have to think about it so much, and yet not feeling better about it. He has he's probably representative of many in that time period who didn't really want to think about it very much, and who didn't like it very much, but who kind of put it out of their mind. And then you come to Washington, and again, one of the ways in which Washington is a representative city is that slavery was here. Right? Slavery was there. Now I'm in Washington, so I will say here. Slavery was here, and it was visible, and it was, you could say, just built into the city, and that mattered, particularly to people who were anti-slavery or abolitionists, and in a way, it was a easy way for them to point to the fact that this is not something we can ignore or sort of try to avoid, or pretend like if we gag people and they can't talk about slavery or eliminating slavery, that somehow the problem will go away. It was everywhere you looked in Washington, D.C. So in that sense, too, Washington was, and for a very long amount of time, I'm going to take us certainly up to the Civil War, was very representative in that way. Now, a way in which it becomes representative in a slightly different way ends up being closer to the Civil War, when Southerners were becoming more aggressively anti anybody who has anything to say about slavery. They became much more defensive, in part because the conversation over slavery is intensifying, over the fate of slavery is intensifying, because as the nation begins to spread its way west, every new state brings up the question of, will it be a free state or will it be a slave state? So slavery more and more is at the center of the national conversation, and Southerners become more and more assertive, defensive, aggressive about it. And some of the violence that I talk about in my last book, as I've mentioned before, is deliberately provoked by Southerners who want to intimidate or silence Northerners who are even thinking about doing anything to stand up to the fate and the success and the spread of slavery. So interestingly, and again, it was harder for me to rummage around, even with the whole book on my computer, to get all of these quotes. So you're going to have to do with me paraphrasing. But what I do remember is, again, in the 1850s, Southerners became very assertive about declaring that Washington was a Southern city. They said it on the floor of Congress. They stood up and said it. Why? Because as they began to get more violent and more aggressive, one of the things that they would say, and that they certainly said more than once, was, if you think you're going to throw us out of Congress for behaving badly, or if you think you're going to send us home, members of Congress, we remind you that Washington, D.C. is a Southern city. And if you think you're going to kick us out of here in any way as Southern members of Congress, you've got another thing coming. This is a Southern city. This is our city. And they say, again, I don't have the direct quote, but they talk about, look at that, people, of course you're coming up with books because you are this community. Slavery in the City, I see about architecture. I mean, truly, in a representative way, looking at Washington as the embodiment of some aspect of the national ethos in some weird symbolic way, is a really interesting way to do it. And again, thus in the 1840s and particularly the 1850s, when you have Southerners saying, if you try and do anything to us here in Washington, we will respond by shedding blood. Pretty representative of what Washington did represent at the time. And it's not surprising that it becomes a kind of pseudo battleground of sorts very early on. Excuse me. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk about Washington a little bit also relies in part on my visit here, my trip here right now. And I haven't been to Washington for a good many years where I stayed for any length of time and wandered around and went to the bar of the Willard Hotel and engaged in conversations with people. I talk to people everywhere. I talk to people. I mean, I talk all the time to like people who pass my way, just because it's interesting and usually not boring or offensive in some way. Typically, you always run a risk. But at any rate, so I've been here for a couple of days and I've been wandering around. And again, what's interesting is, I don't know what I thought, and granted, we now have a Democratic president, and at least part of Congress is, the Senate is more Democratic than Republican at the moment. I didn't think hard about what I thought the ethos in Washington would be like. And certainly the ethos here is different when you have a Republican president and Republicans in power than when you have a Democratic president and Democrats with that kind of power. However, the and this is not scientific by any means, but the bar at the Willard Hotel, I have been told on more than one occasion, is particularly popular with lobbyists. And one of the reasons why I stay at the Willard Hotel is because there were fights in the lobby of the Willard Hotel, and actually a congressman killed a waiter at the Willard Hotel. As a matter of fact, I need to tell you a ridiculous thing that I was told yesterday, again, at the magical bar at the Willard Hotel. I was talking to the bartender and talking about the fact that I was here in part because of the history of the Willard, and I'd written about it, and I'd written about Congress. And he said something like, a lot of history that happened at the Willard Hotel. I said, yeah, I know. There was a California congressman who killed a waiter for not serving him breakfast at the time he wanted here at the Willard Hotel. And the bartender said, oh yeah, I know that. I just don't talk about it. I like this place, but at any rate, the ethos here right now really is, in a pleasant way, and in a way, I suppose you could say an expected way, happily mixed, right? There's no one conversation that is in control here, for better and worse. Certainly not at the bar of the Willard Hotel, but generally speaking, there's a real mix. It doesn't feel like, in particular, that you are, I don't want to even say oppressed, but being overwhelmed by, in one way or another, the tone of politics being particularly left or particularly right. At wandering around the city, talking to people wherever I go, it's just, you get a sense more than anything else of people with different ideas being in one city that happens to be representative in almost any way that you can imagine. What's wonderful about that, of course, is that lots of people with lots of different ideas and opinions bumping up against each other is part of democracy, right? That we can have different ideas, that we can disagree with each other, that we can disagree with each other a lot, that some people can have pretty darned offensive ideas. They have a right to those ideas. They don't have a right to inflict those ideas on others with violence and bullying, but people disagree in a democracy, and that's part of the core of democracy, is your right to think for yourself, to speak for yourself, to protest for yourself, not tagging on violence to that, but really your right to think and speak and write for yourself as you think. That's part of democratic governance. It's part of the vulnerability, right, of a democratic form of politics, or a democratic nation, small d. And that's part of what, and I've certainly spoken about this a lot before, it's part of what the founders were worried about. Granted, they were an elite group of men who were not necessarily overly thrilled with the idea of mass democracy in any sense of the word, but even on a more minimal level, their concerns were that the public couldn't predict what they were going to do, that they were easily not just persuaded, but wooed by, certainly a word we've had here on many times before, demagogue, right? The threat of the demagogue is they are skilled at wooing and appealing to the public, saying whatever it takes to get the public to like them. And then once they have power, they do whatever the heck they want to do with that power. And that's the real threat inherent in democracy. So at any rate, the city feels to me, as I've been walking around, in a positive sense, a mix. All kinds of people, all kinds of conversations, again, for better and worse. So that what I find myself thinking, and this is not certainly by any means an original thought at all, but the fact that I've been walking around the city and saying, in a way, internally over and over to myself, at first without realizing it, you know, there's a very loud, very small minority of people doing a lot of screaming to persuade you that they represent some kind of a majority in the country. Pick an issue and it's probably true. So if you're talking about the issues today that are, you know, most at the center of things, among others, any kind of LGBTQ rights, the whole question of trans people being attacked by people on the right for simply existing, so many different topics, and I'm going to toss gun control in there too. There is a minority of very loud people who want to suggest that they're a very big majority. And what I've been walking around in this representative city and thinking about over the course of the last few days is they're a very small minority. And you can see that if you look at polls, and granted, polls are not always reliable, and two different polls can say two entirely different things. But regardless of that, it's important, I think, to bear in mind, and it's part of what I want to enforce here while I'm here in Washington, that it's worth remembering, it's worth thinking about your assumptions about what you see and hear through whatever you're reading online, whatever you're watching on TV, whatever you're reading in newspapers, versus what that may or may not suggest or represent about a larger whole. I think it's really important to bear in mind that some of the ways in which we may be led to believe, oh no, like there's nothing we can do, that there are all of these people who are disagree with us and they're angry and they're bullying and it's going to be bad. You need to actually think to yourself, it's entirely possible, and I would say probable, that the majority of people in the United States do not agree with these extremists. They don't. The extremists have a real interest in making it seem as though they represent the big us. But it's really important to think about the fact that they don't. They don't. It's easy for me to say it's not going to solve our problems by having me say that, but the degree to which, oddly enough, given that I'm a person who pretty much all the time is looking at weighing the risk factors and not feeling particularly comfortable with a lot of our politics right now, the fact that I came to Washington and part of my response is, they're a pretty damn loud, small number of people. It's a small group of people who are that waving those kinds of ugly flags. Worth bearing in mind, not so that we take our eye off the prize, so to speak, not so that we step back and say, we're all good. I would never say that. And certainly after 3 years, that's not going to be the message you hear from me. But what I will say is, as a way of instilling hope and goading us to continue to take action and take further action, battles aren't lost yet. We are engaged in a battle for democracy. We are, and I'm going to put it that bluntly. And I know that the risk of saying that democracy is, the fate of democracy is at stake. The risk of saying that and of saying it more than once is that people hear it as rhetoric and they don't hear it as a reality, and it sounds extreme, and it sounds like something that, the chattering multitudes are saying, and it's just, a bunch of hoo-ha. I don't believe it's a bunch of hoo-ha. I believe that to be very real, and I think, as I suggested many, many times, we need to remember that. We need to be savvy consumers of information. We need to think very hard about what we see, about what we read, about what we hear, about what that makes us assume about the nation and about what the people throwing those kinds of words and appearances at us, what they want us to believe versus what actually exists. So I'm not saying the words I'm offering today so that everyone can go, I thought it was really dangerous, but I guess it isn't, because they're a minority. I am saying it because that means it matters so much that we stand up for what we believe in, that we stand up to people who are trying to limit rights to a very small group of people. You can name all the people who are being cut out of the group that's going to have a full set of rights, right? I mean, any of the groups being attacked right now of any kind by folks on the right are being, in one way or another, there's an inherent threat that they do have or will have weaker rights, fewer rights. Remember that you potentially here are in the majority and can think and act, that we can come together and we can make a difference. It matters. We are not an overwhelmed minority. We are not thinking things that are on their way out necessarily. We just have to be savvy, smart, inspired, active defenders of democracy. Again, not a new message and not an original message, but kind of interesting and not what I expected to be feeling walking around here in Washington. That diversity in every way that you can imagine it, including just in the climate of politics and ideas and rhetoric, it's there. The question is, do we reinforce it? Do we foster it? Or do we try and eliminate it? And obviously, fostering, spreading, encouraging diversity of all kinds, that's how you preserve democracy. Okay, I'm 1 minute early, but I'm going to stop there. And I don't have a mug. I thought about it. I thought about carrying a mug down, and then I thought I brought a little tiny suitcase. So I did not bring a mug. However, although I am drinking water here today, it's not any water. It's water that is given to me. Let's see if I can do this. With compliments. It's water. It's the people's water. It's the rich people giving me the people's water. So wow. It's in that way. Maybe it's a good representation of American democratic water, right? It's like I had to be able to afford to stay here to get the people's water, but I am being given water. I don't know. I'm having a hard time with the metaphor, but it is regular water. It's the weirdness of Washington, that everything here is representative in more ways than you can count. And then when you boil it all down, it's still freaking water.
Wow.
You know, that
water.
I reached, folks. I tried. I really
like it. I like it. The people at the Willard should give you like a little discount in your room for promoting the people's water. Like, just saying.
I could tell them. I could tell them tonight. I was like, I promoted the people's water. Yeah, it doesn't even, it just has like a little understated symbol on the bottom and on the back. It's like,
or at least zero out your bar tab.
Well, the person yesterday who bought my book also paid for my drink. So, but we're going to do that during the after party.
Accomplished.
That's it. After party. Okay, so let's talk now.
We have questions. All right.
Open chat again.
Yeah.
Okay, I know the people's water is ridiculous. I don't know where that came. It's the people's water from the Rich Hotel. So,
John, at the conference in March, we need to have the people's water. Can you get right on that? All right, we've got some good questions.
Margarita, all water is the people's water.
Right. Thank you, Margarita.
Thank you.
Okay, Sydney asks, why was Washington, D.C. considered a southern city, and how did that change over time?
Well, I mean, it was, granted, it's parts of ultimately 2 states, but it is connected to, Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia is obviously, Virginia's a slave state. So it was seen as a southern city, I think, partly for the very simple reason that it was considered to be in the South. It's, the Mason-Dixon line meant something. It didn't mean that like poof, things changed. I get an early poof.
An early poof for you bigger players.
I know that there was an automatic huge difference between 1 foot and another foot on the Mason-Dixon line, but it was in the South. It was soon to be in the South. There were Southerners living here, right? I mean, there are people of all kinds living here before the decision to make it make a real city and make it the national capital, but in a very real way, it was a Southern city. It just was a Southern city symbolically and assertively, the more the problem of the slavery debate and the fate of slavery came into the center of national conversation and then didn't leave.
Yeah, but it's interesting because when you get later, like during the civil rights movement, I think about the Loving story, and they had to go to DC to be allowed to be married. Yes. It was legal there, but it was not legal here in Virginia.
Yes. Well, exactly. It's another example of what I'm saying, which is Washington as a distinctive kind of a place in a lot of different ways, but representative of bigger truths than necessarily are what are here all by themselves, right? It's representative politically, but it's also representative in some ways better and worse as far as democracy is concerned.
Yeah, I put a link in the chat earlier to the map of forced migration that has narratives, and Solomon Northup, people have read or seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, and it talks about him being captured in DC, even though he had free status, and being forced into slavery. And when students read those types of accounts in that narrative section, they just can't believe it. They're like, but that's not fair. He was free. They just can't understand the, kids have a very strong sense of justice at that age, and they just don't get it. But all right, we have more questions. Dale from Williamsburg asks, right after the Emancipation was issued, what happened to the existing slaves in DC? How did those slave owners react?
Well, I can't specifically tell you how they reacted. There is a really interesting book that I read 100,000 years ago, not necessarily specifically about Washington, but and it's an older book. The title is something like Masters Without Slaves, that talks about the kind of, not the lives, but the what these former slaveholders were thinking, and how they were trying to adjust. And it's not thinking it in a like, oh, the poor slaveholders kind of a way, but in a very, down to earth kind of, their entire world changed. And kind of along the lines of this question, what did they do? What did they think? How do you adapt or not adapt, more likely, when your whole world changes that way? And particularly when this practice that for quite a long time has been seen for what it is, as, brutal, barbaric, repressive, is now actually gone and stated to be that with a fact, in part because of a civil war. So it's a really good question. I just can't speak with authority on specifically what's happening with those people in Washington.
Yeah. All right, our good friend Miranda, who is also a member of our Needle Arts thread on Slack, very active member. Miranda asks, if DC had been taken by Lee in the Civil War, would the citizens have supported it? So many outsiders, yet so many born and raised there as well, especially with it being a slaveholding state.
Wait, repeat the question again for me.
She said, if DC had been taken by Robert E. Lee in the Civil War, would the citizens have supported it? Because it had so many outsiders, but then there are also many born and raised there.
They might have. They might have. It's always, I was about to say, it's always been a weird city. And that sounds more negative than it just sounds. But Washington, for any number of reasons, has always been, it's a southern city, but it's also, as the capital city that's kind of in its own land, a created capital city. It's always a little weird, the huge population comes and goes at the opening and closing of Congress. The people who are here at any given time can change dramatically, and that's always been true too. So, in a way, I suppose that's why I'm talking about Washington today, is that it's representative in many ways, but not typical of a normal American city. And that's what makes it so interesting. That's what makes its qualities and its nature and its the ways in which it's actually representative, I think, particularly interesting.
Yeah, good question, Miranda. Okay, Tom asks, the subject for today's show, the many ways Washington, D.C. has ever and always reflected America's thoughts about itself, is interesting. With the House being elected every 2 years, it seems obvious D.C. should reflect America's thoughts, yet there are times when it seems to trail America, times when it seems to be ahead of America. He wants to know your thoughts about that.
Well, to step back for a moment, Congress, if you're talking about actual representatives, Congress has always been a reactive institution. It's really not a proactive institution. It's responding to demands and requests and circumstances more than anything else. So, in that sense, should Washington, I don't know if I would expect Washington to be leading. If you're representative as a city or as an institution like Congress, you're being shaped and guided, and you are acting at the, if not the will of others, the influence of others. So in that sense, I think Washington couldn't be like a really, what's the word I want to look for here? The word is not modern. It couldn't be ahead of its time. Let me put it that way. It can't be ahead of its time, particularly given the fact that it is the land of government, and government by definition, certainly American government, national government by definition, is responsive and slow, and in some ways a democracy requires that, right? Rather than fast, immediate action based on one person's will, which is really not necessarily democratic. So it's representative in that sense too, I guess, as a city. If it's representative of national politics and the ways in which national politics does and doesn't work, it's going to have its own sort of weird ethos. It's a weird, I lived in Falls Church for a little while and worked at the Library of Congress for a number of years. So I've lived here before. And it really is, and I didn't even live in Washington, I lived in Virginia, but it's a weird, interesting kind of city with a people coming and going and coming and going. There are people, well, this is part of what I'm describing in the early years too, right? There were people who would come and go depending on the government. And then there was like a Southern population that lived here year round. That's what made it feel like a Southern city.
Yeah, I grew up in Alexandria and we used to laugh. We could say the people that lived in DC their whole life wore seersucker this time of year. Everybody got their summer uniform out, which was seersucker. So, and I apologize.
Black.
My neighbor, of course, decided to fire up the chainsaw or some other loud implement of destruction. So I apologize if y'all can hear it. So Linda asks, did the Willard Hotel make changes because of the, this might be an after party question. I'm going to save this one, Linda, for the after party. That's okay. Francesca, our good friend across the pond, says she's hoping to visit DC for the first time. What? For the first time this year. Where should she go? And can that be for the after party? And she wants to know where Bruce would go. Well, I can tell you, Bruce has played on the steps of the Jefferson Monument and on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, at least 2 times I saw him. And he's going to be there in September at Nationals Field, which is our big baseball stadium. So
Jefferson Monument or Lincoln?
Oh yeah, I think it was Lincoln. Yeah,
Jefferson. I don't know how many steps.
Yep. Jefferson doesn't have steps.
Yeah.
So he's played quite a bit of free concerts in DC. The one at the Nats Field is you have to pay, but anyway, there's so many places. Like I would say that if you can get a ticket now, it might be too late for this summer. It depends on when you're coming to get to the African American history.
You gotta
I'm talking about where you went. I'm sure you're able to get in without a ticket, Joanne, because you're Joanne. But like, did you have to order your ticket ahead of time
for the museum?
Somebody you're coming. Yeah.
Oh no, you can. Well, I would say for the African American History Museum, everybody. No, you need to have a free timed entry.
Yes.
So I think I was having breakfast and it was like 10:30 or something, and I said I'm going to go at 12:30 in the afternoon. By the time I left, they were saying at the front door, oh, it's all sold out. You can't come.
They always say that.
Yeah. So I think if you want to see it, you better in the morning or the day before or something like that.
I try and do it a couple of weeks before I go to make sure.
Yeah, no,
for sure. All that traffic for nothing.
Well, right. It didn't, for me, it was kind of perfect because I didn't know, I didn't know I would be a tourist. And then it was like, what am I going to do? And that was I've been wanting for so long to go.
But our new friend, Amy, who is back again this week, she was new and now she's back. So now.
Well, Amy.
Yeah, so she went to, so the Hispanic Museum hasn't physically been built yet, but similar to what they did with the African American Museum, the Museum of American History has sort of a wing now that they dedicate space for the upcoming museums. Like when they were building the African American History Museum, they had some exhibits. So the Hispanic Museum just launched their first public exhibit in that little corner of it. And Amy went yesterday and she reported it was great.
What a great idea that is.
Yeah, and there's a Women's History Museum being built after the Hispanic one. I think is closer in the queue. It's been funded, at least partially. So stuff's happening up there. They're running out of space though,
Yes, but again, on the one hand, it's somewhat it can be somewhat surprising to be like, wait, what? It took how long to get the African American History Museum, and now we're like waiting for women and on the one hand, it's a little bit shocking, particularly given that these museums, like the Smithsonian American History Museum, do end up being kind of representative museums. On the other hand, the fact that these are all happening now, what a positive thing, right? What a great thing that these things
Yeah,
are.
well, it took the Native American Museum a very, very long time, and that it's been there quite a while now. But I remember when that one opened. Have you been to that one, Joanne? The museum?
I haven't been here for so long. I like there are all these museums. I haven't gone to the
So if you come, Francesca, and everyone else, you have to go to the Museum of American Indian, but you need to step back a little bit of a distance because the outside the building was designed to look like the Anasazi cliff dwellings in the Southwest. It is stunning, and you have to eat there. Like, usually I don't like museum cafeteria food, but they have authentic chefs from different indigenous cultures that rotate through that cafeteria. So when you order the Indian fry bread, you're getting the real deal. It is only
okay, that's
cafeteria in DC.
Visit, man.
You should have lunch there before you head back to the airport. It's good stuff.
Very cool to know. Yeah, it's been so long since I've gotten to play here. I like beam in and do something and leave. I have
Francesca, tell me when you're coming. I will drive up. Joanne, if I'd known your event was canceled yesterday, I would have come up. I didn't.
It was last minute, and then I didn't know if I was going to still come. So this has all been like bit by bit, me deciding like, oh, okay. And even to the point that I wasn't sure I was going to stay here today. I thought I was going to maybe go back today. And for a variety of reasons, which we can talk about in the after party, I decided I would stick around for one more day of an unplanned vacation.
Okay, well, Francesca's coming around Thanksgiving. That's great because that's a very slow time schools because everybody's getting out. So Francesca, I can definitely meet you around Thanksgiving. Yay. Okay, so Tiffany asked, why is it the District of Columbia? That's a loaded question, Tiffany.
That why?
At least where I grew up, it is.
Well, you tell me that made you laugh. So,
well, just as an example, so Carolee and I have a friend, Mark, who's a middle school teacher from Minnesota. I think I told you guys he brought his kids here in March, and I hung out with them for a whole day and night. And everywhere you go, there are bumper stickers that say no taxation without representation, kind of like a nod to the colonial era, because they have people that can sit in Congress, but they aren't voting. They don't have the same rights and privileges as all other Americans for DC and Puerto Rico. So a lot of people have bumper stickers about DC representation and Puerto Rican. I see that all over.
it's not a state. I mean, it is a
not
district,
a state.
not
and
a
they've
state.
been asking and begging for years. It's come up multiple times. So that's a big bone of contention, especially in what we call the DMV, which is DC, Maryland, Virginia.
Oh, interesting. But yeah. It is important that it doesn't have representation. It's not in the same way that a state would. It is not considered to be a state. And part of what that means is that Congress governs DC in some ways, right? So that, for example, I'm trying to think of what year it was, 1840, maybe, when Congress ultimately passed an anti-dueling law. It was only for the District of Columbia, right? It was seen as a congressional anti-dueling law because it doesn't really apply. And it was a ridiculous congressional anti-dueling law because you could just go to Virginia and fight a duel, right? So it wasn't, but it was Congress, again, governing for the District of Columbia in its own weird way, and a lack of representation in a conventional way for the people who are here. Somehow that also feels so, the piecemeal way, like federalism, American federalism, and that there's different levels of government, and that could be a very good thing, but then there are all of these pockets and holes and ways in which that presents challenges. And for DC, long-standing.
All right. Our good friend Gloria, hi Gloria, asks, was the famous dinner party compromise done because Jefferson and Madison wanted to control the government by making Washington a southern city?
Well, it certainly mattered a lot where that city was going to be. because it was going, again, magnificent intentions or ambitions. The assumption was it's going to be the capital city. It's going to be a destination place. It's going to be a place, a seat of power in a literal meaning of the word, of the words. So wherever the capital would be, there would be power. And so certainly Madison and Jefferson were not very excited about having New York be that city. Pennsylvania, Philadelphia was seen as better because it was more centrally located. But having the capital city be further south and in the South, sure, that was a part of why Washington, D.C. was chosen. The famous dinner deal, the room where it happened in Philadelphia that moved things here. Yeah. And again, Washington exists as it does, as far as going all the way back to its roots, in part because of a political deal made between really a dinner with three people who ultimately all went off and did their thing so that the decision would be made and Hamilton's assumption of state debts plan would pass. So log rolling, the capital exists where it exists in one way or another because of some form of log rolling.
Yeah. Okay, so Tom's fact checking you. He says he thought the deal took place in New York City.
No, and you're actually, you are correct. It took place in New York and the deal was 10 years in Philadelphia and then moving to Washington. Thank you very much. Look at that.
That's why we need our community, man. They don't give us a break.
I also haven't had coffee.
If I could pour some of this through the computer to you, I would.
Love it. No, but that is an excellent point. And I always say, there was a time where I was sitting in the back of one of the discussion sections for one of my lecture courses, and a student in the class and in the section said, Professor Freeman said X in class, but I think Y. And I didn't say anything, but I was like, yeah. Like, I want my students to step up and disagree if they have a reason to. And then the student turned around and saw me there and turned purple. And I was like, no, that was the best thing. You did the best thing. Stand up for the facts. So that was a good thing. I don't know why the XYZ affair is there, but yeah, I'm only drinking the people's water.
Water, right.
As Kimberly has said.
So Mitch, are you new? I don't recall a question from Mitch before, but Mitch asked, did the Northern Western congressman try to rebrand DC after the Civil War? And he's referencing Kate Major's book, An Example for All the Land. He says, I can't recall if it touched on city culture in that way.
Oh,
like a rebranding after the Civil War?
I don't know that for sure. It would not surprise me in the slightest, because given that it was a Southern city, I don't know, rebranding feels like such a 21st century thing, but certainly revising in a deliberate, public-minded kind of a way, I would think would be crucially important. Plus, during the war, there was deliberate damage done to Washington and its network of surrounding, telegraph wires and such, that the city needed to be fixed up anyway. But I don't know. That would I mean, it probably is in the book that I do not know offhand, but that would make perfect sense and is another way, another example of the sort of representativeness of the city of Washington. You guys,
every 4 years we sort of rebrand DC depending on who wins.
Well, that's true.
I mean, it really, it's weird because if it's a party switch, a lot of people lose their job and move away and go back to wherever they came from, a lot of the staffers, and then they bring all new people in. And then 4 years later, depending on my whole life, we sort of experienced that and laughed about it growing up there. And a lot of kids, parents move there to take government jobs, and then, they move away if their parents' party doesn't win. So it was kind of a weird childhood for a lot of kids at the beck and call of whoever was in power too. So okay, Kathy asks, hi, Kathy. In some ways, it seems so undemocratic for a whole city has no actual direct voting representation in a country that prides itself on being a democracy. So she's wondering, your thoughts on that.
I mean, what matters to me more than anything else is the desires of the people in DC, right? I mean, so assuming that they would like full representation and statehood, then I think that makes perfect sense. It is true. It's a weird Again, a weird construction, or deliberate weird construction to kind of deal with the problem of creating a capital city that no state can really claim. So it's new, and again, it's very much born of the sort of we're going to try out a form of government here, a democratic republic that kind of doesn't really exist, and then how are we going to put this together, and how does it work, and how does it stand up for what it believes in, and how does it ignore parts of what it believes in, and the deliberate improvisational nature of the nation's founding is always part of what fascinates me about it, because it has a deliberateness to it, and a self-consciousness to it. I will not necessarily say unique, as though it's the only time that's ever happened, but it's very distinctive in the way that the nation was founded, just in the method and the mode.
Yeah. Okay. Francesca is asked, oh no, we've already done that one. Let's see. Okay, so I think we've done them all, but we do have a couple. Oh wait, Gloria just added another one. It says a book was written that said George Washington would benefit economically from the location of DC as the capital. Is that true?
Well, he definitely was thinking about shipping, and so yes, I mean, it was financially better for him to, yes, to have the capital here. Let's put it this way, when even before the dinner deal, when there was the final decision about where it should be, he was interested in and focusing on the national government, where it would be, and how that would affect the area around his home, and the Potomac as a major river where there'd be trade and it could benefit him. So yeah, certainly it could and did benefit him some too. This is going to be a goofy thing to say, but I'll say it anyway. When we refer to the founders, right, all in capital letters, it does us a disservice for many reasons. One of them is that it somehow suggests these people are superhuman, when to really understand politics generally, but particularly the founding, you have to factor in all of the self-interested, human, flawed ways in which these people were thinking. Yeah, they were thinking about their own good, and yeah, they were thinking about money, and yeah, I mean, read William McClay's wonderful diary, as he's like, I know why he wanted this because he gets this. I mean, that's, it's part of the founding. The nature of the founding is that it's a flawed human enterprise. These people weren't put on pedestals at the time. It does us no good to think of them that way now. And we've talked before, and I was thinking about this actually when I was trying to figure out what I was going to say in the canceled lecture, about the fact that on the one hand, ideas, something I saw in the museum yesterday too, the ideas that were at the heart of the American founding matter enormously, even though they weren't met, and in some ways haven't been. The ideas matter. And what they matter all the more because then we have to do the work to move closer towards those ideas. So I don't think saying that the founders were flawed and self-interested means the founding doesn't matter and there's nothing at all remotely positive about American history. I do think, and this is again a ridiculously obvious thing to say, our history isn't shiny and beautiful. It has beautiful moments and it has a lot of struggle and conflict, and the struggle and the conflict is beautiful because that represents people working for rights, and that's what we have to keep doing. That's what a democratic government requires. Stepping off soapbox now, but yeah.
Okay, one last question from Dale. Dale asks, do you think the creators of DC envisioned how it would grow, especially the population, and how that would affect the residents' rights? And Tiffany mentioned that we actually have more people in DC than 2 US states. I'm guessing Wyoming, and I'm not sure what the other one is, Tiffany, if you can tell me. I know the lowest is Wyoming usually.
Interesting. I do not know the history of that over time. I'm catching up to what I'm seeing in the comments here. as well. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, there, Tim has posted, because of course someone has, Maclay's journal, which is online through the Library of Congress, and is well worth reading. It is a diary, but that's why it's wonderful, is because it's a very human look at, the first couple of years of the government, in which people don't tend to see it as a human enterprise. And if you strip the humanity out of things and create a hero story, you eliminate the meaning and reality of our history. I love this conversation. Is there a zoo? Yes, there is a zoo.
The National Zoo is not a Smithsonian museum, but it is the National Zoo. And that's where the pandas first came, that Nixon got from China. I was in kindergarten and we got to go see the pandas when they first came. And that was like the only thing I remember about kindergarten, that, and my teacher cried every day. And that was her first and last year teaching. And we all felt bad the next year, like, did we ruin Miss Tucker?
Oh no.
I wonder what happened to Miss Tucker, It
was not the job for her.
She literally cried every day. She was not cut out for teaching. Yeah.
And Amy says it's affiliated with, it might be affiliated somehow with the Smithsonian.
I thought it was separate, but I would have to go back and check. They've always acted like they were totally separate. And when they asked for money, they never, I always thought they had a separate logo, but I can go check that.
Well, we are just about at that time. So
we are. And we've answered all the questions except for one that Linda's made that we're going to hold back for the after party.
Oh, okay, for the after party. So before we do that, let us do what we must do to segue to the after party. And first of all, if you are beaming in here through Facebook, you need to leave Facebook if you're going to join the after party. The after party simply means that we will no longer be recording this conversation. So we can be freer and easier in what we talk about. And I can then talk about the Willard Hotel Bar, among other things. So if you would like to stick around with us for the after party, if you are on Facebook, you need to leave and join us at ncheteach.org/conversations, ncheteach.org/conversations, and join us through that link, and poof, you will be in the after party. I know it's a we didn't even need another poof, but I had to add the other poof. Yes. And also, as ever, first of all, I want to thank Annie and John as ever for making this possible and for being here. But I also want to thank you as ever and for humoring me, my History Matters remotely conversation, in which I had somewhat less of optimal planning time and goods around me, and yet the show always goes on, particularly with this particular community. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. Next week, normal time and place for me, I assume. Yes, because if I come back here to do the canceled lecture, I think it's the week after that, and I don't know yet if that's going to happen. But at any rate, double bingo, man. Thank you very much for coming and engaging in the conversation of democracy as ever, asking the questions that need to be asked. And I guess we can segue our way into the after party.
So John will have to do